Well, the first ever summit between the European Union and the Gulf Cooperation Council is getting underway in Belgium. Now, on the agenda, trade, climate change, and counter-terrorism. Representatives of the 27 EU states are meeting with counterparts from the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, and the group's heavyweight Saudi Arabia. And there's a lot to discuss, including rising tensions between Israel and Iran, neither of which is represented at this summit. Well, the European Union hopes that it can influence Saudi Arabia to help de-escalate conflicts in the Middle East. We want to take a look now at just how far this influence really goes.
The face of Saudi Arabia today, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. He's spent the last 7 years since taking power reaching out to world leaders while cracking down on dissent within. Saudi Arabia has for decades had major influence around the globe because of its massive oil reserves. Western governments want low oil prices, so they've kept the Saudis as close as they can. During the Trump administration, the U.S. pushed the so-called Abraham Accords with other Arab states, with Saudi Arabia expected to be next to normalize relations with Israel after decades of public animosity. The Palestinian cause was a major sticking point. The Saudis and its allies were strong backers of a Palestinian state. Behind the scenes, the Saudis and Israelis were drawing closer until Hamas's terror attack on Israel on October 7th. And Israel's devastating response in Gaza. That made public cooperation with Israel politically impossible. But Hamas's main sponsor is Iran, also a major oil power, and Saudi Arabia's historic rival in the Middle East. Iran also sponsors Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen, all of whom are in conflict with Israel, keeping the Palestinian cause on the front burner and standing in the way of normalization, making European efforts to leverage Saudi Arabia against Iran more complicated.
The kingdom will not cease its efforts towards the establishment of an independent Palestinian state or establish diplomatic relations with Israel without that.
Israel's not likely to allow a Palestinian state anytime soon. But the West, including the EU, wants Saudi Arabia to use its influence to help de-escalate Middle East conflicts before they boil over, and to make sure that Saudi oil keeps flowing.
And for more now, I'm joined by Cinzia Bianco. She's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. She joins us from Milan. It's good to have you with us. I mean, when you look at all the participants here, these are some unlikely bedfellows, if you will. I'm wondering how big a deal is this meeting, considering you've got the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is now in Brussels.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to join you, and for such a historic occasion, I would say, because it's the first summit at the leadership level in 36 years of relations. So it's a pretty big deal. And the turnout was, I would say, quite high level. As you said, the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince is in Brussels, but also the French president, obviously German chancellor. So it's actually a pretty important day for EU-Gulf relations.
And what does today's summit say about how these two powers, if you will, these power blocks, how they're positioning their international strategic interests vis-a-vis each other?
So I think it's a recognition that the two sides have finally decided to take a lot of initiatives that had already been initiated to the next level and give it a clear political backing. It's been a long story of sort of interests that were converging and then diverging, but a lot of opportunities for technical cooperation, policy cooperation, as well as geopolitical coordination, but a lot of missed opportunities as well. And one of the key missing ingredients has always been having a clear-cut political buy-in, which I guess is what this summit is really about.
I'd like to just get your opinion on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. The fact that there are talks of a possible normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now you've got the Crown Prince in Europe, and he has been a persona non grata now for a couple of years. Is he now considered fully rehabilitated, in your opinion?
I think it's fair to say that, since the fist bump with Joe Biden, from that time onwards, there has been a slow sort of rehabilitation that I think we can say now is complete. It's a very geopolitical, pragmatic reasoning and decision. But it makes sense, I think, to recognize the fact that he is going to be leading the kingdom for decades to come. And the kingdom is now an increasingly important player in the region and in the world, in a multipolar world as well.
Yeah, and they all have common interest, don't they? They want to see a de-escalation of tensions in the Middle East. Do they agree on how that de-escalation can be achieved?
I mean, not at the tactical level, I would say, but definitely at the strategic level. There is, again, as you said, shared interests in the stability of the neighborhood and in de-escalation. And there is a shared understanding that a regional conflagration would be disastrous for the interests of the Europeans as well as the regional players.
Cinzia Bianco, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Ms. Bianco, it's good to have you with us. Good to get your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's good to be with you.
The correspondent, Rosie Birchard, is there. Welcome, Rosie. Tell us about the presence of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. That seems significant.
It absolutely is significant because the Saudi Crown Prince certainly brings a level of diplomatic heft to this summit. We know EU officials planning this event, the first of its kind. We're hoping that he would attend. He's seen as a diplomatic heavyweight, a political heavyweight, not only in the Middle East region, but in the world more globally. But of course, he also comes with a lot of controversy attached. It is the Saudi Crown Prince's first trip to Brussels since the scandal around the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And there certainly has been some calls from human rights campaigners, NGOs, that EU leaders should not be engaging with him the way they are doing so today. However, we have seen the Saudi Crown Prince coming in here, walking down the red carpet, waving to journalists, and deep in conversation with EU leaders. So what we can say is that really what we've witnessed at the part of this summit is another stage in the Saudi Arabian bid to move from that once statement, the status of political pariah, right back into the political mainstream.
And what are EU countries hoping to get from this meeting?
Well, the European Union, we know, had been pushing all the way up to this summit to try and get the Gulf countries more aligned with the EU when it comes to the situation in Ukraine and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Because while the European Union has slapped successive rounds of sanctions on Russia over that full-scale invasion, the Gulf countries have overall been ready at some level to condemn Russia, but in other ways they've really kept up business as usual. So the EU was trying to push to get some harsher language on Russia in that text. And I was told by one EU diplomat that the word Russia originally, the GCC countries didn't even want it in their final declaration. Now, the declaration is out and it looks like a compromise in every possible way. They've looked back to language used before in the United Nations. We know that EU countries are also pushing to have some reference to sanctions circumvention because they fear that those sanctions they've applied to Russia are being circumvented within the Gulf, and that certainly has been a tricky conversation as well. But the fallout of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has also seen the EU looking at a new geopolitical reality and looking for new partners in places they might not have looked for before, particularly when it comes to energy. Remember, the EU is racing to try and rid itself of dependence on Russian gas, and of course, the Gulf is a big gas-producing region.
And a brief word about what else the Gulf states want from this.
Well, the EU were trying to push on Russia and Ukraine. The Gulf states were absolutely trying to push the EU to have tougher language on the Middle East, particularly when it comes to criticism of Israel. Now, there as well, where it looks like we have a compromise in this text.
Thank you for that, Rosie. Our correspondent, Rosie Birchard, in Brussels.